Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Cincinnati Art Museum. For any who I have not yet met, my name is Cameron Kitchen and I'm the Louis and Louise Dieterle Nippert Director of your Cincinnati Art Museum. On behalf of the entire staff and our Board of Trustees and all of our supporters, I'm delighted to welcome you to the Ancient Middle East and the 21st Century Museum, a symposium celebrating our recently reinstalled Ancient Middle East galleries at the museum. The symposium is in celebration of 4 years of dedicated work by a great number of individuals and institutions in partnership. For those of you familiar with the museum, you'll have already noticed what a radical transformation this project has made to the physical gallery space. A once dark and cavernous room is now flooded with natural light. Where there once stood dividing walls, there's now transparent casework, allowing objects to be viewed from multiple perspectives. Doorways have shifted to encourage a more dynamic flow. Objects have been hung at differing heights to create architectural context. The double-height gallery has been activated through a contemporary commission, and the color palette and gallery finishes are responsive to the collections presented. Where the natural pigments associated with the ancient world predominate, the space itself was designed to facilitate and communicate the themes that are explored within the gallery. The new gallery encourages visitors to create tangible connections between the art of different empires and to create those connections across time, across space, across geography. In the ancient world, iconography was often shared and adapted. Knowledge, innovation, power systems, and language traverse complicated trade routes alongside trade goods. And so by eliminating the physical barriers that previously divided the space, we also move towards eliminating the metaphorical ones that lead us to catalog and restrict our understanding of ancient cultures. The monumentality of the ancient world is evident to the visitor before they even dive into the labels or complementary catalog available in the gallery. There's immediacy too as you cross the threshold into the space. Through a commission from the artist Shazia Sikander, the past and present collide within the gallery. Inspired by the gallery's ancient artworks themselves, most notably the botanical motifs and the representation of the female form, painted and laminated windows traverse the space lining the clerestory windows above. These serve not only as a source of light, but they bathe the gallery in glowing greens, reds, and yellows, prismatic colors. The ancient Middle East was a colorful, vibrant place, and a live place. And while there were certainly hyper-arid zones, so too were there areas of natural verdant lushness. Additionally, we know that many sculptures had initially been painted, though that paint has not always survived. The Sikander windows disrupt the perhaps unconscious, implicit idea that the ancient Middle East was all desert or devoid of color. The windows serve as a bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. It's too easy to think of the cultures represented in our gallery as only existing in the past. But the reality is that the trade routes we explore in gallery continue to have relevance today. Technology, power, art, ideas, religions, and people continue to connect across borders and geographical boundaries. The care and the attention with which every element of this project was executed reflects the significance of these collections, not only to our audiences here in Cincinnati, Ohio, but to the global community of which we're a part. The Ancient Middle East Gallery is one of ideas, but it's also one of people. The descendants of Dr. Nelson Glick, the archaeologist who originally excavated Kirbet Tanner, are great supporters of this project. While they couldn't join us today, they share our enthusiasm for the gallery and what it signifies for our community. Here with us today is Dr. Andres Reyes, the partner of the late Dr. Judith Mackenzie. Mackenzie is a scholar who ushered Glick's work to its final publication, scholarship which is paramount to our gallery today. In addition to being a vital contributor to that project himself, Dr. Reyes also generously provided the museum team access to Mackenzie's materials. We thank the families of Nelson Glick and Judith Mackenzie for their ongoing support. I also wish to note several organizations which are critical to the success of this project, which itself was born from a collaboration between the museum, the University of Cincinnati, Hebrew Union College, and the Islamic Center of Greater Cincinnati. This blending, this combination of voices, perspectives, experiences, identities, thoughts, and ideas was critical to the shaping of the gallery and its success. We very much wish to continue to build on this successful collaboration, and we're honored to host this evening's community roundtable titled Museums and Civic Engagement. It features representatives of Cincinnati's religious, academic, and civic institutions, and the roundtable begins immediately following our keynote, part 2 of the discussion today. Other organizations of note, of course, include our own National Endowment of the Humanities and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The gallery would not be what it is today without the generosity of these two major funders. Barbara Wayand and Daniel and Susan Fowl serve as lead funders from the private giving to this project, and there are a handful of individuals I wish to thank specifically with assistance to this project. Within our museum team, the curatorial team is led by Dr. Ainsley Cameron, curator of South Asian art, Islamic art, and antiquities. She's joined by Cincinnati's curatorial assistant, Trudy Gaba, and 2 PhD candidates from our collaborating academic institutions. Sarah Wenner is a student at the Department of Classics at the University of Cincinnati, and Julia Olson is a student at Hebrew Union College. We wish them great success as their Mellon Foundation-funded curatorial fellowships wrap, and we look forward to seeing where their academic paths take them in the future. And yet, you'll see from tomorrow afternoon's talks, the effects of this project touch upon every department within this museum. We wouldn't be here today if not for our design and installation team, our registrars, our learning and interpretation team, the finest in the nation, led by Emily Holtrop, our information technology team, and the list goes on and on. Beyond our museum, Dr. Joseph Green, formerly of the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, has been a close collaborator and a contributor to the catalog. Thanks are also due to Dr. Jack Green, the recently appointed Jeffrey Horrell 75 and Rodney Rose Director and Chief Curator of the Miami University Art Museum, and Dr. Barbara Porter, the former Director of the American Center of Overseas Research in Amman, Jordan. They assisted greatly in the planning and implementation of the museum's trip to Jordan in 2020 and prior, and have continued to be incredible supporters of our work. Additionally, we would like to thank our speakers who have each contributed expertise, knowledge, scholarship, and countless hours over the years of the project. They read materials, they share thoughts and opinions, and they truly collaborate in shaping our museum's thinking. Our relationships with our colleagues in Jordan are paramount, especially those of the Department of Antiquities, the Jordan Museum, and the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Amman, as well as our colleagues at the Petra Museum itself. Cincinnati Art Museum has a long and robust history working with these institutions, and we're honored to continue these vital relationships in close collaboration. I myself had the pleasure to travel to Jordan with our colleagues in 2016 and to receive a Jordanian delegation here at our museum just a few short years ago. We continue to foster these relationships, and we're honored to be stewards of the most significant collection of Nabatean sculpture outside of present-day Jordan. We had hoped that our colleagues from the Jordan Museum, Director General Ihab Amareen and Director of Technical Affairs Yosha Alamri, would be here in person with us today, but we have the second best here, is we have a really elegant and lovely recorded message from these two individuals and leaders within Jordan and within our field globally. They sent this video, which I introduce to you now. I'd like to step aside for a moment and hear the words of our colleagues from Jordan.
Dear Director Cameron Kitchen, dear Ainsley and Sarah, we are very grateful to you for giving us this fantastic opportunity to say salam from Amman, the heart of the Middle East, and in specific from the Jordan Museum that sits within one of the oldest areas where our grandfathers managed to establish one of the oldest urban settlements in the history during the Neolithic age. The museum narrates the story of innovation, resilience, and cultural diversity throughout more than 1 million of years. I'm confident the symposium will be a valuable and rich scientific and cultural event as it discusses several cultural aspects and themes throughout 4,000 years in our region, the Middle East. Our museum aspires to be a vibrant regional center for enhancing cultural heritage through several tracks of work, starting from research, and restoration, ending up with proper presentation and interpretation. My colleague, Dr. Yosha, will give you some highlights of the museum presentation and interpretation, making use of the available interactive technologies. And here I would like to thank you again for sending us this beautiful catalogue. Hope you all the best.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning from Amman. My name is Yosha Al-Amri, or Joshua, Director of the Technical Affairs at the Jordan Museum. On behalf of the Director General Engineer Ihab Ammarin and the Jordan Museum, we do wish you a great gathering and successful discussions. This is a 3D print of the topographic map of Jordan, where visitors can start with their tour at the Jordan Museum and they can have a look at this topographic map and benefit from the information it provides. For example, agriculture in Jordan, rainfall, people which governorate have most people in Jordan, solar system, potential solar power, wind power also, which areas, and the minerals and mines in Jordan, and of course where our collection here at the Jordan Museum come from. One of the approaches we use at the Jordan Museum is also to replace some of the missing parts of the most important objects with 3D prints. For example, this decorated slab of stone, one piece is on display at the Dar es Saraya Museum in Irbid. So we had to do a 3D scan of the part in Irbid and produce it with the 3D printer so the visitor can have an idea of the original object, how it was in reality and how it looked like once. So we have here at the Jordan Museum a 3D scanner and a 3D printer that help us also in our display. We also pay attention to our blind visitors at the Jordan Museum. Also, for them we provided these replicas of inscriptions. It's not only this inscription, but also other inscriptions here in this hall. They can touch the inscription, they can touch the object, they can also feel it. Not only blind people, but also visitors from early ages, from schools, from even other visitors can hold this replica and feel the inscription, which we also want them to create a relationship between the visitors and the archaeological remains in the outside the museum. So if someone finds an archaeological object, what he does with it, he brings it to the Jordan Museum to benefit, because behind each object there is a story or a piece of a story that we can create here at the Jordan Museum. We urge them to touch these objects. Of course, one of the highlights at the Jordan Museum is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And every visitor to the Jordan Museum wishes to touch one of these slices or have a question, how does it look like, how this inscription is made, and so on. Therefore, we installed this 3D scan of one of the slices of the Dead Sea cover scroll. This scan enables visitors to rotate the object, this scan, and have a look how it looks like from the obverse, and how even the writing itself, how the alphabets were created, and they can rotate, they can enlarge every spot, they can have a closer look at each point of this cover scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
One of our main activity here is a puppet show theater. It's a kind of the theater to be easy for the kids.
As also part of the world with this pandemic of COVID-19, we had to lock down the Jordan Museum. Jordan in general had to lock down everything, and therefore we had to convert also into online activities. Online activities, we had to install the modern techniques, audio visual applications, devices, so we can also, we had to in several times go online, and we still also benefiting from this technique for the future. This will be something either hybrid activities and online activities, physical attendance activities at the Jordan Museum. Ainsley and Sarah and all the colleagues at the Cincinnati Museum, all colleagues in this symposium, we are so sorry we did not manage to travel to be part of this gathering. But in brief, this is the Jordan Museum. This is how we benefited from the different approaches and different developments in other fields to enhance our exhibition and also to make it a rememberable visit of every visitor to the Jordan Museum. Thank you very much. Thank you all, and wish you a fruitful discussions. Thank you.
So my final words before I turn this lectern over happily is that it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morag Kersel, our keynote speaker for this evening. Dr. Kersel is an associate professor of anthropology at DePaul University. In addition to participating in archaeological excavations and surveys in Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, as well as elsewhere, she's interested in the relationship between cultural heritage law, archaeological sites and objects, and local interaction. She also works on the public display and interpretation of archaeological artifacts in institutional spaces. She's a co-director of the Follow the Pots project, which explores the two interconnected sides of an archaeological looting story: the conventional archaeological investigation of prehistoric urbanism in the southern Levant, and the multiple and contested values of this material to various stakeholders today. In this moment of increasing transparency and desire for more complicated narratives in museum spaces, and I can assert that if we don't address them in our spaces, our visitors ask them nonetheless. Dr. Kersel is here tonight to speak about how objects come to be stewarded by museums and what that means in the 21st century. Doctor, it's all yours.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Are you? Okay, excellent. So in November of 1979, a group of students from small-town rural Ontario boarded a bus for the bright lights and big city of Toronto. That day, I was one of hundreds who stood in line to see King Tut at the Art Gallery of Ontario. The Treasures of Tutankhamun exhibit traveled to 6 American cities and then went on to Canada, ushering in the era of the blockbuster museum exhibition and reinforcing the role of museums and objects as elements of soft power cultural diplomacy, which I know tomorrow Professor Macaulay will give us more of an excellent case study in cultural diplomacy on the columns from Jerash at the World's Fair in New York. Millions of people lined up for hours to see the show. Museums became the hottest tickets in town. There we go. I start with this vignette not only because it's the 100th anniversary of the archaeological discovery of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings, and I'm going to use it all year. My students are already sick of it. But also, this is the reason I'm here today. That pivotal class trip changed my life. I became obsessed with archaeology, Egypt, ancient things, but more importantly, I became entranced by museums, the public display of the past, and how people and objects interact. So while I may not love the Michael Lee Chin crystal, I do love the places like the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and I acknowledge the role that it played and continues to play in my life. But it, like many museums, has issues. I want to thank the good people at the Cincinnati Art Museum, Cameron Kitchen, Ashley Cameron, Sarah Wenner, and Julia Olson for the invitation to think about museums and collections in this moment of intense scrutiny and self-reflection. I'm so happy to follow my Jordanian colleagues, whom I know very well, in a place I love very much. And I was so happy to see the Ain Ghazal statues as the little puppets used in the kids' play. I work in the Neolithic period, I will just say that. So, I've tried to credit all of the images and ideas I'm using today, so hopefully there are no copyright violations. I'm not here to dismantle the Universal Museum. I'm here because of the Universal Museum, or to demand the return of artifacts. I'm here to advocate for greater transparency, honesty, and contextualization of objects in museums. In what promises to be a very interesting day tomorrow, we'll hear specifics about some of the material culture in the Cincinnati Art Museum. But for now, I want us to think about some of the ways that ancient objects arrive or get into 20th century museums, and the ethical issues that might accompany this object movement and display. I cross this bridge every day on my way to work, and I'm always thinking about my place as a guest living and working in the traditional homelands of the Miami, the Kickapoo, the Peoria, and the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. The city of Chicago remains a contested space for First Nations who continue to claim legal right over the land. DePaul University, where I teach, resides on land that was ceded under duress in the 1833 Treaty of Chicago. I acknowledge these painful histories, and in my teaching and research, I work towards rectifying ongoing injustice. But as we know, land acknowledgements are just words if we don't act. And so I encourage you to support First Nations sovereignty and self-determination by donating to the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology at the University of Alberta to support their important work investigating First Nations residential schools in order to bring the lost children home. So the reasons people frequent museums are varied as the institutions they visit, but visit they do, and often in search of singular items, enticed by the gold mask of King Tut, or by a T-Rex, as my colleagues, Chad, York, and I are entranced by Sue at the Field Museum in this image, or compelled to learn more about the Nabateans. They can just go down the road here. Most museum goers give little thought to where the items and exhibits come from, how they end up in museums, or if they should even be in the museum. Often exhibition text panels, labels, and catalog entries provide little or no information to answer those questions of museum goers. In 1986, we were asked to consider the social life of things, the idea that objects aren't static, but they wander in and out of different classifications of value and use over their duration. Initially, the idea was focused on notions of commodification, value, and exchange, but object biographies and the ideas of objects with lives and agency has been usefully explored. And while the paradigm persists, there's been a lot of critique and subsequent reconsideration. So in my own work, in the desire to follow a pot from the ground here at the early Bronze Age site of Baba Dra in Jordan to the consumer or to the museum, it might assume a linear trajectory, but the reality is far more convoluted and enmeshed in a jumble of movement. It's really a trip. So in reaction to object biographies, and these are the pots that from that looted site on sale, legally available in Jerusalem, but that's a topic for another day, of which I'm obsessed, I will just say. So in reaction to the concept of this object biography, scholars have expanded the trope to include a more comprehensive approach, or an itinerary looking at the movement of objects. The trip might be filled with gaps, fragmented, and never-ending. In the excellent Seeing History Anew, the Ancient Middle East and 21st Century the 21st Century Museum catalog, the various entries provide admirable insights into the movement of the material into the CAM. And I'm going to use the CAM. Is that okay? Okay, great. All right. To be sure, there are gaps in the biographies and itineraries of the CAM objects. This is a point skillfully articulated by Julia Olson, but the guide is a brilliant accompaniment to the gallery, challenging us to think about the daring do's of Nelson Gluck. And I have to say that my first archaeological project was in the Negev Desert under the auspices of the Nelson Gluck School of Biblical Archaeology in Jerusalem. So I have a soft spot for both Professor Gluck and for HUC. The ways in which ancient objects get into this 21st century museum are myriad, but we're just going to look at 2 ways tonight. So in her collection of stories, Olson highlights the eliding of histories, the confusion of facts, and the necessity of provenance research in her account of the itinerary of the fragment of a stone relief depicting a winged genie from the Neo-Assyrian Nimrud. Unearthed by Laird in the 19th century, the relief left Iraq as an object of partage. Maybe it went on to a porch in Dorset, England, then ended up in the hands of a dealer who sold it to the Cincinnati Art Museum in 1952. I've become increasingly obsessed with partage and how that practice led to the current conditions. Partage, from the French to share, is a long-standing system dating to the 19th century, which ensures that under the supervision of the relevant Antiquities Authority, artifacts that were discovered by an archaeological excavation would be divided, sometimes between the excavator and the nation state, and sometimes including the landowner. Sorry, I've lost my place now. Where are we? My apologies. But I encourage you, if you really want to deep dive into the politics of partage and papyri, I encourage you to look at the recent paper by Brendan Hoag in the January 2021 issue of American Journal of Archaeology. Partage was established by caretaker, and here I want you to think about Western colonial institutions and legal regimes who were occupying or in charge of these areas in places like Egypt, Iraq, and Palestine. And Haag argues this ensured that Western scholars and collectors continued to enjoy the privileged access to this foreign material culture, a privilege which we still enjoy. With the establishment of nation states in the post-Ottoman period came the enactment of national ownership laws and the end of partage, pretty much. A downside of partage is the loss of archaeological integrity, actually, as artifacts excavated from a single context are divided in order to meet the demands of all of the participants. Yes, we know the archaeological find spot, but once united objects from a single cache, a burial, or a palace are dispersed, perhaps obstructing our understanding of the past. A great example of dispersal are the reliefs from the Northwest Palace of Ashur-Nazirpal II at Nimrud to institutions and individuals across the globe. Through the system of partage, with the permission of the Ottoman overseers, Austin Henry Laird sent pieces far and wide, including to his cousin Charlotte Guest, who was the original owner of the piece that's housed here in this museum. But archival accounts document a friendly rivalry over the palace reliefs between various missionaries who were posted to Mosul during the moment that Laird was excavating. It seems that missionaries and seminaries doing the work of God were considered best poised to care for culture, and in return, they received items with biblical associations. So between 1850 and 1860, American missionaries in Mosul and other influential individuals acquired at least 55 fragments from this palace for their alma mater colleges in New England, as well as for private institutions. So reliefs are now located in places like Amherst College, the Hood Museum at Dartmouth, the Detroit Institute of the Arts, Bowdoin College, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Brooklyn Museum, I encourage you to consult with John Russell's, with a great contribution by Judith Mackenzie, I will say, the excellent volume From Nineveh to New York, The Strange Story of Assyrian Reliefs in the Metropolitan Museum and the Hidden Masterpiece at Canford School. And they do an admirable job of recounting the wild and wonderful trips that these artifacts took. So 3 of these reliefs made their way into the Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, where they were curated and available for educational access. Fast forward to 2011 in a report to the Dean and President on the accessioning and deaccessioning of fine art in the VTS collection. The report was a direct response to a fire on campus and a series of insurance appraisals and growing concern over campus safety and conservation of their artifacts. In the report, Associate Dean Roger Furlow made the case for deaccessioning, citing the seminary's failure to care adequately for the reliefs. In the wake of cultural heritage destruction in Iraq by Daesh in the mid-2015 to 2016, a 2017 insurance audit at VTS assessed the economic value of the 3 reliefs. It had risen dramatically, resulted in a much larger than expected insurance premium of almost $70,000 a year, just to insure those 3 pieces. After much discussion and consultation with students, faculty, and staff, the VTS Board of Trustees decided to sell the largest of the 3 reliefs. In defense of the outcry in the wake of the announcement, VTS stated that they had approached 3 museums in the DC region about potential purchase, and none were interested or able to raise the funds for the purchase. Preceding the Christie's sale, the Iraq government issued calls for repatriation, the return of the artifacts to Mosul, claiming that the slab was Iraqi property and citing the Iraqi antiquities law. In considering responsible stewardship and the current state of affairs in Iraq during that period, decision makers at VTS determined that repatriation was not an option. So in October of 2018, Christie's auction house sold the 7-foot stone panel from the VTS collection. Max Bernheimer of Christie's remarked that it was a sale for the generations. We'll never see anything like it again. The price realized was well over $30 million. In defense of their sale, the VTS released a press statement stating that the proceeds from the sale would go on to underwrite their bicentennial initiatives, such as vocation scholarships, a diversity fund, and the funds would also be used for conservation and display of the remaining 2 reliefs. While the buyer of the VTS relief remains anonymous and it's no longer on public display, the remaining 2 fragments have been conserved and reinstalled in a much more prominent location, providing greater access for faculty, staff, and students. This is all timed to coincide with their bicentenary in 2023. But let us think about this relief from Nimrud in Alexandria and the legacy of Partage. While it was legally available for them to sell, was that part of the original purpose of Partage? In a recent review I did of the OI Gallery Enhancement Project, I noted that from the mid-1920s to the early 1930s, archaeological excavations sponsored by the University of Chicago to Anatolia, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and Palestine resulted in the collection of thousands of artifacts, often acquired under the terms of Partage. The OI Museum now houses and displays artifacts that include many other things, the amazing lamassu or winged bull. And I have to say, I live 10 blocks from this, and I'm delighted to be able to visit this anytime I want. But that is a privilege I have. I totally acknowledge that. In the introductory case of the collection highlights at the OI, an explanation of Partage is included, although the term is only implied and never explicitly used. The same is true in the amazing catalog that I mentioned earlier, Seeing History in You. So when I queried Dr. Cameron about why there was no use of the word Partage, she suggested that the term was, and I'm going to quote you here, I hope that's okay, unnecessarily opaque. Within the museum galleries and in our print material, we're communicating to such a wide variety of audiences that we strive to provide information as clearly as we can. We strive to break down barriers between visitor and objects so they can focus on connecting the material, end quote. Standing in contrast to both the OI and the Cincinnati Art Museum is the Metropolitan Museum of Art's more transparent label, which was highlighted by Professor Macaulay in her recent review of the exhibit Making the Met, 1870 to 2020. Quote, the discourse around partage continues today, some seeing it as fair and advantageous for all, while others consider it a system based on colonialism and exploitation, end quote. Typically defended as being legal, partage is receiving increasing scrutiny, mostly by me, I will say that, as a colonial and imperial construct established by non-local overseers of cultural heritage to ensure artifacts from archaeologically rich areas made their way into foreign collections as compensation for excavating. For me, not using the term partage is a missed opportunity in an honest acknowledgement of the legacies of underpinning the museum and the discipline of archaeology. I also believe it does a disservice to the museum going public, but I'm happy to receive any and all pushback and to discuss this further, because I know it's not, it's a hot topic for debate. So tomorrow, we're going to hear all about the Wonders of Persepolis from Dr. Allen, but as a teaser, I offer this amazing fragment depicting a palace guard, which was a 1961 gift to the CAM from Mr. and Mrs. John J. Emery. I show this to introduce another way objects enter museums, through donations. As we all know, gifts usually involve some sort of obligation and/or reciprocation. Donations of objects to a museum with a 501c3 status can enable one to deduct the artwork's full fair market value. But collectors don't merely donate to get a tax break. They're interested in education, class, refinement, and cultivation, which are implied by owning artifacts. But attaining these qualities requires an investment of time, effort, and money. Possessing some special, generally unavailable items instills status on self and envy in one's competitors. The quality and rarity of possessions is a sure sign of quality and rarity as a connoisseur, as well as the strength and conquest of competitors over rare objects. So infamous Israeli antiquities collector Moshe Dayan justified his self-indulgent site raids and purchases by reminding his critics that his collection would eventually be donated to a public institution, the Israel Museum, for the betterment of public education, and of course, to serve as a testament to his benevolence. The pinnacle of creating and accumulating can be to have one's collection displayed in a museum. What better way to transmit taste, knowledge, market, and aesthetic skills and expertise than by exhibiting pieces? And I couldn't resist, this just appeared yesterday in The Onion, the screen capture where maybe we have art imitating life. I'll leave that to you to decide, yes. So I've been investigating the movement of archaeological objects from the ground to the consumer since 2002 when I started my PhD research. And I noticed, and I do that through a series of ethnographic interviews. I interview people who are buying, selling, collecting, exhibiting, all kinds of, and basically anybody who's willing to talk to me. And I noticed that between, there was something going on in around 2010, 11, 12 in the Israeli market, which is where I do most of my research. But I could not figure out what it was. So between 2009 and 2014, I knew that the market was changing and that people weren't willing to meet with me, and there were different materials available for sale. But I didn't know it was basically one person who was moving the market. In their book, Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby, Candida Moss and Joel Baden suggest that Steve Green and Hobby Lobby changed the market for Holy Land antiquities with the acquisition of over 40,000 artifacts. Particularly, they were interested in textual materials like Dead Sea Scroll fragments and Bibles and other ancient papyri related to the Bible. They also argue, that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, right. They also argue that the motivation behind Green's acquisition of the artifacts was not for personal enjoyment, but for eventual donation and placement in the collection of the Museum of the Bible, which opened in 2017 in Washington, D.C. Green bought artifacts, built a museum, and then donated his artifacts to the museum for the tax write-off. Everybody wins. Or do they? Because as we all know, or maybe you don't know, but I'm going to tell you, in January of 2011, Customs and Border Protection seized 5 packages that were falsely labeled as originating in Turkey. The items arrived at different Hobby Lobby addresses, labeled only as ceramic tiles, clay tile samples, with different countries of origin. And in July of 2017, after a 6.5-year probe, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn filed a forfeiture complaint as part of a settlement agreement with the Arts and Crafts Company. The complaint compelled the Oklahoma-based corporation to forfeit cash proceeds to the tune of $3 million and also almost 3,500 objects, 450 ancient cuneiform tablets and 3,000 ancient clay bullae. They were all related to unlawful importation. The complaint also mandated that the company's personnel should attend workshops in ethical collecting practices. I don't know if they did, but yes, they were compelled to do that. I'm happy to say that the artifacts were all repatriated to Iraq in May of 2018. In another donor story related to the Museum of the Bible, and I will also say I've probably visited that museum more than anyone else, which is an interesting claim to fame, I would say. So anyway, in another donor story that's related to the Museum of the Bible and the Greens, and I say Hobby Lobby Museum of the Bible together because it's very unclear when it's one individual or when it's the corporation. That relationship is really unclear in most of the documentation. They loaned a 3,600-year-old religious text showing a section of the Sumerian poem of the Epic of Gilgamesh to the Museum of the Bible. It was looted from the Iraq Museum during the Gulf War in 1991. In 2014, Hobby Lobby bought the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet for more than $1.6 million at a sale at Christie's. Christie's, that could be the common denominator here too. So after the earlier seizure debacle and a bunch of fake Dead Sea Scrolls at the museum, the Museum of the Bible instituted a provenance research policy and dedicated individuals to just that. And a curator in researching the provenance of the Gilgamesh Dream Tablet noted significant gaps. The museum also informed, at the same time, they informed the Iraqi government that they had the item in their possession. And in September of 2019, the US government seized the clay tablet. The Museum of the Bible didn't contest the removal of the tablet, which was on loan from the Hobby Lobby Corporation. And I need to revisit to see if they've changed the label because last time I was there, which was in the January of 2020, it was on temporary, it was temporarily removed, but now it's been, I'm happy to say, it now has been repatriated to Iraq, so it's not temporary. And it's gone back on display. If you saw last week, there was a huge press release and press event at the Iraq Museum. It's back on display there. So in their defense of their suspect acquisitions, Greens, the Hobby Lobby, suggested that the company was new to the world of acquiring antiquities, and they didn't fully appreciate the complexity of the acquisition process. This resulted in some regrettable mistakes. In the case of the Gilgamesh tablet, they are suing Christie's auction house for not carrying out their due diligence on the object they consigned, and I understand that there may be an agreement in the works on that. All very sad for them, but perhaps we, and by we, I mean museums, national governments, and us, the academic community, could have done more to raise awareness on the connection between demand for undocumented objects and the destruction of sites. According to Neil Brody, the belief that antiquities might prove good vehicles for investment first took hold in the 1970s in a time of high inflation. So we should really be watching the antiquities market now during another time of high inflation, when it was thought that tangible assets might hold their value better than more traditional financial ones. I once met with a collector who had purchased a Cycladic figurine with a paint ghost, I will say, which I worked in the Cyclades for 3 years and I never saw anything quite like it. It was a complete one. And he told me he bought it because it was a better investment than the stock market, and there were no Bernie Madoffs in the mix. Those are my days, interviewing people like that. I mean, honestly, who could ask for more? And it's clear from this quote here that Michael Steinhardt believes there's money to be made in antiquities. Yes, I'm going there because, oh, what have I done? Hang on, sorry. There we go. Okay, yes, because this is really my latest obsession, and next month I'm going to London to continue this research. In 2014, Michael and Judy Steinhardt loaned 9 Neolithic masks, and that is from about 7,600 to about 6,000 BCE, to the Israel Museum for the face-to-face, the oldest masks in the world exhibit. Only 2 of the 11 masks that were on display had associated, although I would say tenuous, archaeological find spots associated, and they are part of the permanent collection of the Israel Museum. The rest were purchased from the antiquities market. All 11 masks were displayed together with nothing distinguishing the archaeological masks from the market masks. The exhibit catalog states and labels stated only unknown sites. You can see where I'm going with this, right? Expert in comparative microarchaeology Yuval Goren spent 10 years carrying out scientific analysis on these Steinhardt masks. This resulted in a map in the exhibit and in the catalog of possible find spots for the undocumented things owned by the Steinhardt. This is misleading in that only systematic archaeological excavation would provide us with the necessary contextual evidence to state exactly where these masks originated, and if there really is a cache of 5 masks that existed in antiquity. In the didactic materials, the exhibit labels, the text panels, associated with face-to-face, there is little or no discussion of the acquisition of the artifacts in the market or the undocumented nature of the 9 masks. There was much acknowledgement of the generosity and kindness of the Steinhardts and their loan, but no mention of how demand for archaeological things like this mask can and does lead to looting at sites. And this is looting at the Neolithic site of Wadi al-Katafi in Jordan, and I want to just preface this by saying, don't get me wrong, we have never found anything like that at this site, and I don't want anybody leaving saying or thinking anything misleading like that, although it would be pretty sweet to find a mask or 2 out there in the eastern desert of Jordan. So it leads to looting. And by exhibiting the documented and undocumented masks in the same place, by providing the scientific imprimatur of the created find spot and the fictional narrative about a cache supplied by the geoarchaeologists, the Israel Museum added to the market value of the pieces should the Steinhardts decide to donate or sell their masks in the future. But they aren't going to, are they? No. Because after a 4-year multinational investigation in December of 2021, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office determined that 180 items in the Steinhardt collection had been looted and smuggled from 11 countries, trafficked by 12 illicit networks, and appeared on the international market without any lawful paperwork. Steinhardt surrendered 180 stolen objects valued at more than $70 million and has been barred for life from acquiring anything else, whatever that means, yes. Included in the 180 objects are the 9 masks. And last week, in a ceremony in New York, 28 artifacts that had been identified as coming from Israel were officially returned, which included the 9 Steinhardt masks, which now are part of the Israel Museum's collection. Worldly status can be, and okay, yeah, so I had to include this because I absolutely love this. Like, I don't know who works at the Haaretz, but to put Michael Steinhardt's face behind one of his masks, okay. Worldly status can be and is conveyed through the medium of the museum. We, the museum-going public, see artifacts on display donated by Steve Green and the Steinhardts. We're filled with awe, admiration, and gratitude for their donation or loan. And in return, the collectors are imbued with a greater cultural status, and their roles as hedge fund managers or craft supply chain owners are masked by an essentialized and naturalized social standing through museum display of their acquisition. Neil Brody has suggested that if antiquities are collected for reasons that are external to the objects themselves, for personal redemption or to provide a passport into polite society or the creation of cultural capital, this moves away from the collection as an end and onto the collection as a means to the end. The end here is capital gains for the individual mediated through museum valorization. There's a durability and persistence of objects, allowing them to move in and out of spaces, imbuing them with particular meanings and functions. Objects lay dormant, they disappear, they're reused, they change context, their lives are filled with holes, and for many, there's no direct progression from beginning to middle to end. When they reach their final resting places in museum vitrines, is the journey at an end? I would say not, but I'm also happy to argue that. So, the newly configured Middle East Gallery at the Cincinnati Art Museum and the accompanying Seeing History Anew, the Ancient Middle East and the 21st Century, demonstrate that in many ways the journey is beginning anew. In pairing the ancient with the stunning contemporary glasswork by Shahiza Sikandar, visitors are encouraged to think about the past in the present. Objects enter museums and collections in various ways. We've only scratched the surface in thinking about their acquisition and movement, but the attitudes of museums and the average museum visitor towards artifacts with iffy backgrounds or contested things that are enmeshed in the political are often in a state of flux, caught up in emotions. Seemingly innocent exhibitions are often embroiled in backstories of which the public is often blissfully unaware. And maybe it should remain that way. Also happy to discuss that. Artifacts can't speak for themselves, and in order for people to engage with them, we, the museum-going public, rely on museum professionals to guide us. However, it's not only the museum's duty to provide the entire picture about items on display, it's our duty as visitors to question not only why things are on display, but how they came into the museum and if they should remain in the collection. So in this moment of museum reckoning, never before have we seen such a calling for truth-telling in a museum, a place where consultation, collaboration, and shared authority are increasingly the norm, and where there's an acknowledgement of the legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and where transparency and an honest presentation of the facts are of paramount importance. The redesigned Middle East Gallery at the Cincinnati Art Museum, with its new informative labels, clear sight lines, which I was enthralled when I walked into your institution today and turned and saw this. It gave me shivers. It was amazing. The thematic displays all offer us, the museum-going community, the unique opportunity to experience an ancient collection through a 21st century lens. Thank you.